morning everybody. Today we're going to teach you how to complete your quilt. I'm very excited about this. It really came out beautifully. The trucks is very large. Like you can see, this is the 4x4 hoop quilt I've done. I started initially doing the 5x5 hoop, but I soon realized that it will be very difficult to get that large quilt for you all on video. So I only did the first row in 4x4, and then I went over to the to 5x5, and then I went over to 4x4 and completed my quilt in 4x4 hoop size. So all of these blocks are done on small 4x4 hoops, but just look at the size of these trucks. Gorgeous. So you, although your machine can only stitch 4x4 size, you can create very large projects. It just takes a little bit more time and a little bit more patience, but it's well worth it at the end. So let's get started with our quilt. First of all, I want you to take your whole quilt that you've assembled now and trim 1/4 inch from the side all around. You're then going to cut a big piece. I'll try and put a photo in because my camera can't zoom out that big, but I've put a big piece of batting at the back. You can see how far I actually cut it bigger. That is to make provision for our sashing that's going to come and for our binding at the end. So cut, I would say fairly, let's measure this quickly and see. This is about 11 inches bigger than my quilt. If you're going to add very wide strips of sashing, then of course you will go wider, but I think for 11 inches you're not going to add that much to your quilt, otherwise your pictures is going to disappear in the center. So I would say 10 to 11 to 12 inches is probably will be more than sufficient if you cut your batting a little bit bigger than that. So I've also pinned my quilt to the center of my batting. Mark out the center of your batting, just place it in the center and pin down all around your quilt to the batting. I'm just for now going to put this separate so I can show you how to cut your sashing and your binding. Now for those not familiar with sashing or binding or what it is exactly, I'm just going to show you on this quilt I did last year. This was the Christmas quilt I've done. Now what we mean by sashing is normally pieces of fabric either between blocks, or it can be, like in this case, a piece of fabric around the blocks. It creates a little frame and you can add various colors. Just depends on how wide you want to go and what effect you want to create. Right on the edge you've got double folded binding. This is what finishes off your quilt so you don't see any raw edges. I'm going to show you in this tutorial how to do this wide binding. I like wide binding more than a very narrow binding. I just feel it frames the center image much prettier than a very thin binding would do. So let's proceed with our one. Now for my quilt I decided to do 2 sashing strips. I don't want just one. I decided to do the little stars, and then I'm going to do a strip of black. Get my black strip here from the back. Then I'm going to do a black strip, and then I'm going to do my white stripes, yellow and white. So more or less in that fashion is what it will look like when I'm done with mine. This of course will be folded in half. So you can easily see what the quilt will look like when it's done. So you can decide on what you want to do. You might want to put the black first and then the yellow, and then you got your stripes. Or you might just want to leave out the stars altogether and just have a black with white stripes, white and yellow stripes. So it really depends on what you like and what you want. You can even add more layers if you prefer to do so. So your strips that you're going to cut, decide on your width. This one I just want a narrow little strip, so you're going to take 1/2 inch off here to know the width. So decide on how wide you want it and add 1/4 inch to either side for stitching. The black I want a little bit wider, so I've actually cut it double the size of my yellow. And then I want if not a very, very wide binding, but a little bit wider than the normal standard is. So I've cut my binding then for the edge. So you can go ahead and cut your strips. How you will measure it out is take the full width of your quilt, take it once, and you'll take twice for the top and the bottom, do the same for the sides, and then add about, because as you go wider, as you move out, you will use more and more and more. So what you can do is just add about 10-11 inches to the side, and you should be fine. If you don't want to waste fabric, you can perfectly measure. Remember to add, if you want to measure the width, and you know you're going to add that strip, you know you need to add another inch. If you're going to add that one, you need to add 2 inches, so you know how to cut your binding. What I did is I just measured from batting side to batting side and cut it 4 times. And I know I will have plenty. I will even have a little bit left over. I'd rather make up too much than too little, as you don't want to go back and make a little bit more and get everything out again. That little wastage is not going to make a huge difference. So for safe sake, cut your sizes from width to width with your batting. Now let's start assembling this quilt. Just putting my strips aside. I'm going to use my yellow stars now. I'm going to put it wrong sides together. And I'm going to start stitching 1/4 inch. So my stitching will be more or less on top of the right of the edge of the embroidery. I'm going to stitch my strip in place on the top. You can pin it down for the first strip. That would make it probably easier for you. By the way, I've cut, and you can see I've joined all my pieces. And I'll show you in a minute how I did that. And I'm going to start just a little bit of an overlap there. And I pin right through the batting my strip to my quilt. Now when I come to the end here, because I've made up a whole long strip of this, you can actually cut away the extra. I'll just leave a small overlap and I will cut this off. So I'll come back now to do the other side. We're first going to stitch this side all the way through from one side to the other with a 1/4 inch to that side, and then we can continue with the rest. I've stitched my first strip in place and I've folded it over and ironed it flat so that it stays in place. I'm now going to turn my quilt with one of the sides facing me, and I'm going to add another piece to my quilt. So again, I'm going to place down on that 1/4 inch. You can leave a little bit of a flap there. You're going to, from the edge of where your previous one stopped, your previous strip. So you're going to overlap there and stitch that down. So we're in fact creating a border with these strips that we are doing. When you now come to the end of this one, we're going to trim it next to your quilt again. I'm now going to sew down this piece, same as before, with 1/4 inch, and then we're going to turn it over and iron it, and then we'll complete the next row. I've now finished the second side, and you can see how beautifully it's already starting to look with the border around. So we're now going to again turn the quilt and do the next side. So this is the bottom actually I'm going to do now. Again, laying down my border and pinning down as I go along. Coming to the end here, I'm just going to cut the extra off of my strip, and I'll sew that down, iron open, and then we'll complete the last side for the first color. The bottom of our quilt is now done. Now we're moving on to the last side, adding a strip to finish off the first row of sashing. And you can see I've got a small strip that's extra, so it's not a low big of waste. Rather have enough than making up too little. You can now go ahead and stitch this last seam with 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then we're going to add the second strip. Now to add your black, it's exactly the same as we've just done. Just make sure, because your black is more like a two-sided color, that your seam allowances does go to the top, so that when we turn it, it is at the bottom. So make sure your fabric is the right way around, and then just start pinning on the edge of the yellow where the yellow stopped. You will start pinning your fabric to your sashing in exactly the same way as we did our first lot. Go now and stitch 1/4 inch, turn it over, iron it flat, and then we'll add the second side. Now ready to add the last of the black strips to the bottom. Go ahead and stitch 1/4 inch seam allowance, the last section of the sashing border. I'll show you what it looks like then, how we progress, and then we're going to trim and we'll add our binding. Isn't this becoming a really gorgeous quilt? Just love the yellow stripe, and the black really makes everything pop. We're ready now to add our binding to the edge. So we need to trim our batting to the correct size. Now first of all, I'm going to trim all these corners. We need now to work out exactly how much batting we need to leave here for our binding. So first of all, measure your width of your binding that you've cut. I've cut mine 4 inches. Then you need to subtract half the inch because you're going to have a 1/4 inch seam and a 1/4 inch seam on this side. So you subtract that, so you get 3.5 inches divided then by 2, which gives you, because you've got a front and you've got a back, which gives you then 1.75 inches that you need to cut your batting larger. Cut a piece of back fabric, a little bit larger than your quilt. I found that spray basting works really well for me. So I would take my 505 spray, lightly spray the backing in sections. So I'm first going to do this corner and then just press my quilt down. I'm then going to do the next corner, or you can do half sections if you want. And bring my over smoothing it out as I go. Can now do the top section. I'm going to do that in one go. Smoothing it out as I go along. This keeps it nice and flat and easier to work with now, so it's not layers slip sliding around. You can turn your quilt around now, so we've got our back fabric in place. And you can now trim your back fabric the same size as where your batting is. If you are worried the basting spray won't hold your back fabric, by all means you can go ahead and just thin it down. For my binding, I'm going to start in the center. We're going to stitch right on the edge of the black, a 1/4 inch inward. You're going to start in the center, but a little bit to your right, and leave a little tail piece so we can join the two pieces later on. So you can start pinning your binding to your quilt. When you come to the corner, You will stitch from here till where your black ends, and then I'll come back and I'll show you how to do the mitered corner. I've now stitched from where I started to the corner, but I stopped where my sashing ended as well. I'm going now to take the rest of my binding and I'm going to throw it upwards. Just finger press that corner, making sure it lines up with the inner corner of your sashing there. And then bring it straight down again. So you're making your fold where your batting ends and not where your fabric ends. So I'm folding the fabric back on itself, but at the edge of the batting. So you can see there where it stitched through there, but then I folded it up and then down and along my sashing strip again. I'm now going to start stitching right from the top, 1/4 inch, all the way down again to where the black sashing stops. I've stitched this whole side. I'm coming to another corner, so I'm again going to pull up my fabric, making sure it's making a nice mitered corner right to the corner of your sashing, pulling it up and bringing it down again, making sure the fold is right at the edge of the batting at the top. And coming down on the edge of the sashing. You can now go ahead and stitch this side. Again, you're going to stitch right from the top to where your sashing ends at the bottom. You can then complete the remaining 2 corners and leave a little opening where we started, so I can show you how to join the 2 pieces. After you stitched from corner to corner, we're now ready to join our 2 pieces. I'll just remove any pins I had. You're then going to overlap and then make sure that the one piece is 1/4 inch longer than the other one. So just take your scissors and trim the longer one a little bit shorter. So when you join the 2 pieces, that you will have a neat finish. We're now doing a mitered join on this one. I've done in previous tutorials the mitered method of doing it. So if you prefer the mitered method, please have a look at one of my previous videos where I explained how to join with a mitered corner. This one, because I'm just using stripes, or if you have a plain fabric, it's really not necessary to do it at an angle, so you can just do a straight join. So you can take it back to the embroidery or to your sewing machine and just join these 2 pieces, and then you can close the seam. I'll show you then how to turn it and how to stitch it to the back. You can now see here where I've joined it, and I then went in and I stitched down the edge of the quilt. So I've got a neat finish all around, and my batting is in place, my binding is in place. I'm ready now to turn it the other way around. So you can open up your binding and just give it a good iron all the way back. When you come to the corner, you will see it will give you a beautiful mitered corner. So just iron it around your batting to the back, forming that perfect corner to your back. You'll see as after I've ironed it, everything will lie nice and neat and flat, and you will see how it finishes then. Coming up to the last corner, so you turn your fabric, then just give it a good iron so everything lies neat and flat. And you can turn in with the raw seam. And pin down. And when you get to the corner, you'll see you can just fold it in like you would a gift to form a beautiful mitered corner on the back as well. Now, I like to hand stitch my binding to the back so that I have a neat finish in the front, and I don't see stitching through my binding at all. But it all depends on what you want. You can use a decorative stitch on your machine and just stitch the binding on the back to your quilt, and we're all done. So this is your finished quilt. With your binding all in place. Now that you have your quilt assembled, your backing in place and your binding and your quilt is all done, we're ready to do the fun part, and that is to make the dies and the little cone play pieces. These play pieces uses very little fabric. You more or less need about 12 inches by 9 inches for each piece. It will actually be stitched a little bit smaller, but I give you this size so that if you stitch the larger ones, then this piece of fabric is sufficient. I've used a polyester cotton, polycotton fabric that I've used. It felt quite soft to me, so I decided to just iron-on backing stabilizer to it, just to stiffen up my fabric. As you can see, you needed to have it, keep its shape quite good. We are going to stuff it with some soft toy stuffing, but I'll show you everything. But if you do use a very thin fabric, I do recommend ironing on a stabilizer to the back to stiffen up your fabric. If you're using a denim-like fabric or something thicker, then it shouldn't be necessary. It's quite a small shape, and the cone shape is strong on itself, but a very soft fabric will make it look bumpy and not give you nice straight edges. The same goes for your dies. On this specific one, I did not use any stabilizer. This is just 100% cotton, and I've stuffed it. But you can see it because of it's a soft fabric, it does give you kind of rounded shapes. So if you don't like that and like a more square shape, then stabilize your fabric with the iron-on stabilizer before you start making these. These specific ones, the size I'm holding in my hand, is the 4x4 sizes, so it's the small one. As I made a 4x4 hoop quilt as well, these are all 4x4 little squares on my quilt. I decided to just go ahead with the 4x4 sizes so the play pieces fits nicely onto the various blocks. So let's get started making these fun toys. Before we start, if you do not want to use the toys, by all means you can buy real little construction little trucks and have the kids play with the trucks instead of making these little cones. But I do offer these in week 10, our final week of the Quilt-Along, and I hope you will enjoy making these as well. Let's get started. For the cone pieces, I hooped one layer of a very thick cutaway stabilizer. Again, it's just to make sure that your play piece actually keeps its shape. You're now going to stitch the first step right onto the stabilizer just to show you where to place your fabric. If you're using a hoop like I do and I more or less know where it needs to go, then you can, if you want, straight just add your fabric on top and then just stitch the first two steps. But for argument's sake, I'm just going to do the first step to show you the placement. That's the normal applique steps. You normally get 3 steps in applique, and that is first a placement line, then a tack down line, then we cut out the fabric around the shape, and then we do the final step, which will be your satin. So I'll just show you example. The block, the dice is done exactly the same way. So you will do all your squares, all 6 squares, and then we will stitch our squares together. So let's get started on making one of these cones. I just want to mention I'm using my big hoop, as I do have a big hoop for my machine. So I'm actually doing both of the shapes. That will be the cone and the bottom, the same hooping. If you only have a 4x4 hoop, you will of course do one and then do your other one. So you will need 2 hoopings if you only have a 4x4 hoop. By all means, your larger hoops, you can, if you want to make more than one play piece, you can actually fill your whole hoop with pieces and do them all at once. You don't need to do one by one by one. I've now finished stitching the first color. I hope you can see it there. I did it in the same green that I'm going to use for the outer edge of my design. You can go ahead and add your fabric over your guide that you stitched. And if you want the back of the bottom of your cone to also have fabric at the bottom and to give it a little bit more stability, you can just add a piece of fabric to the wrong side of your circle. That is the bottom of the cone. So you're not going to add fabric to the wrong side of the cone half circle shape you've got, only onto the circle. So this is the back of the hoop. I turned my hoop, and only on the circle did I add fabric to the back as well. I'm now going to take it back to the machine to stitch the zigzag step. I'm now going to trim the extra fabric around the zigzag shapes that just stitched. Also trim on the wrong side of the hoop around the circle. And we're now taking it back to the embroidery machine to finish off the edges for us with a satin stitch and a decorative fill. After you've stitched the final step, we can now remove it from the hoop. I just use this little Stanley knife tool on my cutting mat, and I just cut as close to the stitches without cutting the stitches as I can. I find this a little bit easier to do than using scissors, but by all means, if you only have scissors, just cut using your scissors. You can of course go in, if you missed a few spots, just go in with your scissors and just neaten up your raw edge. Careful though not to cut your stitches. Now on the cone, one side you'll see there's like a little bit of an extra flap. We're going to use that to glue, or you can hand stitch as well. There's several methods of completing this. So you will just overlap that area so your 2 satin edges meet. And you can either use a fabric glue. I've got several types of glue. This is a Fabric Craft and General Adhesive hemline glue. Or you also get these handy little glue pens that you can use to just lightly add your glue to the end. Then fold. I'm just going to trim this extra stabilizer I see on the edge here, so I get a nice clean edge. Then just bring it over, and where the 2 satins meet, I hope you can see what I'm doing here. I'll just hold it for a little bit, and there you can see the cone shape. Now, you don't need to use glue. You can use the double-sided bias tape that you get, that you can also add onto your side and then peel off and stick. It's also not a permanent fix, so you will need to actually hand stitch. It's too narrow in the point to actually get in with the machine. So you will need just to quickly to hand stitch this opening closed. When you get to the bottom, after you stitched it closed, don't cut off your thread yet. You'll take your cone, and I'm using this very fine stuffing. It's very soft. It's a polyester filling. So I'm just going to stuff that in, and you can really stuff as much as you want. If you like it to have a nice rounded shape, you can stuff quite a bit in there. And compact it as good as you can. Okay, and once you've got that in place, you can now add your bottom. Again, you can either use your fabric glue to just keep it in place for you for a moment, and then hand stitch all around to make sure that it's secure in the hoop. I applied the glue, and I'm just holding it with some pins to give the glue a chance to dry a little bit. And while that is drying, let's continue making the dies. Now I went ahead and stitched all my squares, and I then placed my squares next to each other, and with a zigzag stitch I just zigzag all the shapes together to form a cross. So you can have the numbers in any sequence you want, or you can follow the sequence that I've got. So your 1 will be in the center and your 6 will end up at the top. You're then going to start closing up your shapes. After I stitched, I can just mention, after I stitched all the shapes together, the fabric felt a little bit flopsy to me. I used a fleece, so I just went ahead and added another layer of iron-on stabilizer to the back just to stiffen up the shapes a little bit better for me. So you can do that if you want. It's optional. You really don't need to if you don't want to. Now again, in this case, you can, if you really want, stitch this block together using your sewing machine. So you can either place it right sides together, and then right on the edge you can just apply a zigzag, and not too wide, I would say about a 3 to a 4 millimeter wide satin, and you're just going to catch on the inside of your satin all around. So you can go ahead and do that, and there's quite a few, all 4 of those you can stitch together, and then we can do the last 2. So I'll go ahead and do that. You can also, if you want to, use hand stitches to stitch these together to give you a nice crisp edge. But I will show you now the zigzag on the machine will also deliver quite a good zigzag stitch for you. After you zigzagged the sides together, you would have left one side open to enable you to add your stuffing inside, and then just hand stitch the one open side closed to finish off your dies. I hope you all enjoyed making this quilt and that you had fun doing the quilt along with me, and that I will see you in future for more beautiful quilts to be made in smaller as well as larger hoop sizes. Thank you so much for joining me. Till next time.